Hi, Rama. It's week 35, day 3 of our Bible narrative reading plan, and today we're in Ezra chapter 6. We've seen that God has been faithful to his people Israel, and he's brought them back from exile. This is all taking place while Daniel is an older man. We saw that in Daniel chapter 6, and we see that King Cyrus is working and bringing God's people back. But as we come to the beginning of chapter 6, before we can continue the story, we need to pause for just a moment. You know that I've told you, I've taken the position that Darius and Cyrus are the same person. The only problem is that we don't have historical evidence to know who Darius is. We have historical evidence for Cyrus, and it helps us to keep the timeline straight. It helps us to understand who all the actors are in world history at this point. So there's a little bit of lack of clarity as to whether Darius and Cyrus are the same person or if they're very closely related people, perhaps father and son or successors to the throne. So we see here in this chapter, you may have noticed that there's a few places where it sounds like there may be separate people, two different people named Darius or Cyrus. I've taken the position that it's the same person, and that Darius is a title. But either way, we get the gist of the story, but I did want to address that point of possible confusion. Because as we see at the beginning of chapter 6, it seems like they are going to expound or further implement on the decree that we saw back in chapters 1 and 3 that has brought about the rebuilding of the temple. And so Darius makes a decree here in verse 1, seems to simply be saying a memo or a directive to his people, hey, go get that order that I've already issued. And so they search in Babylon in the archives, it's not there. It's actually in his summer home or another palace away from Babylon. But they find the decree, verse 3, that let the house be rebuilt, the place where sacrifices were offered, and let its foundations be retained. So this is the original decree that we saw back in chapters 1 and 3. And we see the dimensions here down there at the end of verse 3, which reminds us why it seemed perhaps a little strange that the people were crying and mourning that this temple was not as grand as Solomon's temple, even when this one is going to be a bigger temple. But regardless, they have found this original decree, and now Darius is saying, look, I want this done, and I don't want my people, the Persians, interfering. And so the kingdom is paying for the rebuilding, and so we see that it's based off of the tribute, the taxes taken from other provinces. But he's saying, you guys don't need to interfere with this. He makes it very clear to the Persian citizens, the Persian diplomats and military leaders and government leaders, leave it alone, let this be done. Verse 7, let the work on this house of God alone. But we get a little bit of insight into why he's doing this. Verse 10, that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. So perhaps he's not completely doing this out of the sincerity of his heart. Perhaps he's found a new relationship with the God of Israel, or perhaps this is part of his political plan to prosper in this area. Perhaps like a lot of people, it's a little bit of both. But notice there, the king and his sons. Again, this might be pointing to the fact that Darius and Cyrus are father and son rather than the same person. Either way, we see that God is working. This decree is issued, and so the rebuilding of the temple is going forward. We see in verse 14 that Haggai and Zechariah are prophets during this time, ministering to God's people. And we see ultimately that the celebration of the Passover is reinstituted. It's been a long time since they've done that. And the chapter comes to an end saying the Lord had made them joyful and had turned the heart of the king of Assyria to them, so that he aided them in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. We see that both the God of Israel and Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia, they're mentioned there in verse 14. God is working, but he's also working through the human agents, the people here on earth, the human kings. God tells us in the book of Proverbs that the hearts of kings can be channeled in the hands of God, that God can work in their hearts, he can mold their hearts, he can do what he wants to do. And the children of Israel see this play out before their very eyes as he has turned the heart of the king of Assyria, the king of Persia, to work there in their own lives and in the life of Israel. And so there's nothing that is impossible for our God. Here's a summary of today's reading. For more information, go to tunemyheart.org.